Now, we had hoped to begin this morning's programme in conversation with Dr. Waney Squier. She's the consultant paediatric neuropathologist who was struck off earlier this year because of evidence she gave as an expert witness for the defence in a number of cases where a parent had been accused of killing a child by shaking it. Dr. Squier disputes the existence of shaken baby syndrome, which causes around 250 criminal and family court cases each year. Earlier this month, she won a High Court appeal and was reinstated in her job, but told she would not be allowed to give expert witness in court for the next 3 years. Unfortunately, she's been told by her medical director not to give any interviews at this time. She let us know earlier this morning that she couldn't make it today. So what are the implications of this whole case and the controversy around shaken baby syndrome? Alison Holt is the BBC's social affairs correspondent. Alison, why was Dr. Squier struck off?
Well, Jenny, she was accused of becoming dogmatic and going too far in the evidence that she gave for the defence in 6 cases involving accusations that a child had been harmed or killed. Now, by way of background, as you say, she's a paediatric neuropathologist, so she has spent much of her life work studying how babies' brains work. And she used to appear for the prosecution in cases where a person was accused of harming a child by shaking. But then she began to question the science behind so-called shaken baby syndrome, which is now more often known as non-accidental head injury. And so she started appearing for the defence in these cases. She maintains that the reason the tribunal was brought against her was that she was being targeted or scapegoated for challenging the mainstream views in this very controversial area of medicine.
What is the mainstream view of it?
Okay, well, the mainstream view is that if you have a child who has collapsed suddenly or died, then if they're found to have bleeding behind the eyes or on the brain and swelling on the brain, this is what's known as the triad. And the mainstream view is that if you see these 3 signs in a child who has collapsed or died, then unless there is another explanation, then the likely cause is shaking. Other explanations might, for instance, be a genetic condition.
And why does Dr. Squier dispute it? What does she say she believes?
Well, she disputes it because she says there isn't the science behind it. And in general terms, my understanding of her view is that she thinks that there may be explanations or causes for the triad that we don't yet understand, and there are different things that have been suggested, such as choking or short falls in certain circumstances. But again, as an outside observer of this whole area, it seems an area where there is a great need for more research. And interestingly, in Sweden, where there's been a major review of scientific literature behind the diagnosis after a miscarriage of justice there, it was carried out by a highly respected body. I've spoken to 2 of the key researchers, and they say that they looked at 3,700 scientific papers examining different aspects of non-accidental head injury, tested the methodology, looked for bias within the papers, and at the end of it, they narrowed it down to say that they felt there were just 2 papers which they felt had scientific merit. Their conclusion was that there needs to be much more research into this whole area. They say in the end it may well prove to be that the triad is linked to shaking, but at the moment there needs to be more research to give greater certainty in this area.
So why did the High Court reinstate Dr. Squier, but with some reservations from the judge?
Well, the High Court looked in detail at the case, and I sat in on a couple of sessions there where they were going back over the cases which she was found wanting in the evidence she gave at the tribunal. At the end of it, the judge concluded that she hadn't been dishonest in the way in which she had dealt with things, but he still found that she'd misquoted scientific papers and gone too far, so that what she had done amounted to serious professional misconduct. he reinstated her as a doctor, but put that restriction on her appearing in court cases or giving medical evidence in court cases for 3 years.
How much support does she have within the medical profession?
Do you know, it's really difficult to say, because she is not she's not alone in having views which challenge the certainty or the mainstream view behind these shaking cases, so-called shaken baby syndrome. And I would say over the years things have shifted. So there are now many more questions being asked if a child is found to have this triad of symptoms. People do look for other explanations. I think the question is, the difficulty arises when you get to something like this arriving in the court. So you have medical science coming up against the law, and the stakes are incredibly high. You know, if a child is abused and the person walks free because of a dispute over the medical evidence, then that's a tragedy. But if a parent, and in these cases it is often a parent or carer who's accused, if they're found guilty of harming their child when they did nothing and they're jailed, that's also a tragedy. So you can really see why these cases evoke such strong emotions, and they do often turn on the medical evidence.
And other professionals I know who share her view have said they won't act now as defence witnesses. Why?
I think it comes back to the question of whether or not you feel that Dr. Squier was targeted for stepping outside the mainstream. She and others who hold similar views to her certainly feel that's been the case. The General Medical Council, which brought the case against her, is adamant that it looked specifically at these cases, and it was not about her challenging of the mainstream view. It was actually about the way in which she gave evidence.
Just remind us briefly of some of the famous cases where women have been wrongly convicted of killing their child.
Well, there have been one of the most high-profile ones was one in the States in the 90s involving Louise Woodward, a British au pair who was accused of shaking a baby who in her charge, who later died. She was originally found guilty of murder. That was later reduced to involuntary manslaughter, and a lot of the court case was played out here with her giving evidence about what happened to the little boy, talking about popping him onto a bed, which there was a great discussion over what that actually meant in terms of whether that involved violence or shaking, and there was some dispute over the if you like the language difference between Britain and America. In this country, there was the Lorraine Harris case, a woman, which was actually a key turning point for Dr. Squier. She was jailed for the manslaughter of her baby. In that case, Dr. Squier appeared for the prosecution in the first case, but when it came to appeal, she had looked again at her views on this, and she appeared for the appellant. Lorraine Harris was cleared of the manslaughter of her child. Suzanne Holdsworth, a babysitter, wrongly jailed for the murder of her child. She was freed after an appeal court decided there were problems with the evidence against her.
Alison Holt, thank you very much indeed for being with us this morning.